Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Jonathan Doe. I'm the Associate Dean of Research, Co-Faculty Director of the Moran Center for Global Leadership, and I hold the Rammrath Chair in International Business here at the Villanova School of Business. I will serve as your host and moderator for this afternoon's panel. I think this is a really timely topic, the whole issue of trade wars and trade disputes. Just in the last few days, President Trump has said he thinks we will move forward with increasing from 10% to 25% tariffs on a whole host of imports from China. Doesn't think there's going to be a deal worked out to forestall that. Of course, you read that GM announced massive layoffs, possibly partly due to some of the challenges that GM is facing in terms of its trade relationships, especially the price of imported steel and aluminum. The new NAFTA, and I was involved in the old NAFTA, so I'm going to have a hard time saying USMCA. Sounds like YMCA, doesn't it? You want to hear that song in the background, but I got to get used to it. Will be signed on the 30th at the G20 meeting in Buenos Aires, at which also President Trump and President Xi will be meeting, perhaps to discuss a deal or a potential deal, although Scott says that's very unlikely, and we'll have a chance to talk about that in just a little bit. In order to get started here, I'm really excited to welcome our four stellar panelists and also outline the format of our discussion this afternoon. To my immediate left, I think this is in alphabetical order or something close to it. To my immediate left is our own Michelle Casario, who's assistant professor of economics, and with me, co-faculty director of the Moran Center for Global Leadership. Michelle is a frequent commentator and analyst on trade issues for places like CBS News and others. She especially follows trade agreements and the impact of trade on the U.S. economy. To my immediate right is Roselyn Hsueh, who is associate professor of political science from down the road at Temple University. She's affiliated with Temple's Asian Studies and Global Studies program. She's a Global Order Visiting Scholar at UPenn. Also a member of the Georgetown Initiative on the US-China Dialogue on Global Issues, and perhaps most relevant for us, she wrote a book published back in 2011 called China's Regulatory State, A New Strategy for Globalization. Welcome, Roselyn. To my far right, your far left, is Scott Kennedy, who came up from DC today. Thank you, Scott. Scott is Deputy Director of the Freeman Chair in Chinese Studies and Director of the Project on Chinese Business and Political Economy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, one of the preeminent international policy think tanks in Washington. He's a widely quoted analyst and expert on issues of global trade and integration, especially as they concern US-China relations. He's also author of a couple books, including The Fat Tech Dragon, Benchmarking China's Innovation Drive, and Perfecting China, Inc., China's 13th Five-Year Plan, and The Business of Lobbying in China. So he's been writing a lot about US-China trade and economic relationships. And finally, to my far left, your far right, is our own Deborah Seligsohn, who's assistant professor in the political science department here at Villanova, having joined just last year. She primarily studies environmental governance in China, India, and US, and China and India, as well as US-China relations, but she also follows closely trade and economic issues between the US and China. She had a career with the US State Department, which took her to China on a number of tours, and that was followed by a career at the World Resources Institute. So as you see, we have a very well-qualified group of panelists here to engage in this important discussion. Now, the goal of this session is to bring as much information forward as we can in as short a period in time, and so we're going to try to keep things moving along as quickly and rapidly as possible. As the moderator, if we start to get bogged down a little bit, I may redirect the conversation or move on to another point or line of inquiry. But before we start, in order to kind of understand the basic context here, especially for those of you who are not trade policy wonks like us up in the front, I wanted to spend just 5 minutes talking first about some of the terms and terminology that you may hear this afternoon. And I'm not going to go through all these definitions, but trade can be a little bit of an inside baseball game here. And so you're going to hear things like FTAs and tariffs and Section 301 and 232. Do stop us and have us define some of these issues. I think you're probably all familiar with what tariffs and free trade agreements are, but some of these other terms may be a little bit less familiar to you. So if we get too wonky, please slow us down or stop us. But I also wanted to spend just a minute or two talking a little bit about how active this trade agenda has been over the last year or two, and frankly, how active the trade tension and friction agenda has been. And with the assistance of our own economics student here, Ian McPherson, here's a couple timelines that lay out what has been happening really just in the last year and a half or two. First, with respect to NAFTA. As you will recall, when President Trump was then candidate Trump, he indicated that he had a lot of skepticism about NAFTA. He said it was the worst trade agreement in history, which I personally took a little offense to, having been involved in it. But he threatened to withdraw from NAFTA or renegotiate it, and indeed initiated a series of negotiations which stretched over about a year and a half, culminating in what I mentioned earlier, which is now called the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement. The detailed text was released a couple months ago, and then, as we indicated, will be signed later this week, but still requires congressional approval, and this may be something we want to get into as part of our discussion. Also, another area which we're really not going to spend much time on this evening, but I think is worth mentioning, is that there was another trade agreement in play when President Trump took office, and that was the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And like NAFTA, he didn't say it was the worst trade agreement ever. He said it's the second worst trade agreement ever after NAFTA. No, he didn't say that. But he did not see the value in the TPP, and it did made good on his threat to withdraw the U.S. from the TPP, and he did so. But the other 11 members of this TPP, these are either Asian countries or Asian-facing countries, continued their negotiations and actually reached an agreement, now called the CPTPP. Along the way, the Trump administration had at least signaled that it might be interested in getting back involved, but some of the CPTPP signatories, said, no, too late. We've done deal. We're already good to go. But I would predict that at some point we may find ourselves back in bed with this group of countries. And then finally, really what we're going to spend the bulk of our time on this afternoon and this evening is really the whole series of trade follies between the U.S. and China. And again, I'll just highlight a couple of the key milestones, which was the initial announcement by the U.S. To impose tariffs on washing machines and solar cell imports, then followed by a broader set of tariff limitations, and again, some of these under one of the sections that I referred to earlier, which deals with national security. And again, we can talk later about whether indeed this is the appropriate mechanism for securing our national security, safeguarding our national security. But there's clearly been a volley, as you see from all the entries on this timeline, back and forth, culminating most recently, as I said, in President Trump's indication that these goods that are now facing a 10% tariff will soon be facing a 25% tariff, and perhaps all Chinese goods will be facing tariffs coming into the United States, which is a pretty profound reality to contemplate, at least in my history and experience on this topic. So there's just a little bit of background, a little bit of the context to get us started for this discussion. And as I said, we're going to try to make this as interactive as possible. I have a set of 3, 4, 5 questions that I will ask either the entire group of panelists or a subset of them. If you would like clarifications along the way, feel free to raise your hand. But round about 6:15 or 6:20, I think we will be finishing up with our portion of the dialogue and discussion, and we're going to turn things over to you. And we very much welcome your questions and commentary and input. So I also wanted to thank, before we go any further, Debbie for initiating this. She and I met a couple months ago, and she said, we really ought to have a panel on this whole trade war situation. And surprisingly, we actually did it. We actually pulled it together, thanks to you and your colleagues. So we really appreciate that. So let me start perhaps with Scott and Roselyn, if I might. In order to help us understand, again, some of the basic context of what's been going on and why it's been happening, can you just briefly share with us what is this trade war about? Why has the Trump administration resorted to steps and mechanisms that have not been as frequently used by his at least immediate predecessors? And why has China retaliated with its own penalties? So try to help us understand a little bit about why what is happening. Scott.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot for inviting me, and appreciate Debbie doing getting everything started. And it's wonderful to be on a college campus. I taught at Indiana University for 15 years, now I'm in Washington, D.C., and it's a place where fact isn't super important, and where opinions are, and you can change your opinion from one day to the next. And so I'm really looking forward to the conversation tonight, and to the conversation with everyone here. As probably everybody knows, the U.S. and China are just about to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations, that was January 1st, 1979. We also are coming up in a couple weeks on what will be the 17th anniversary of China's membership into the WTO. And certainly, as the two countries established diplomatic relations, originally based around countering the Soviet Union, they discovered actually that they could have a substantial commercial relationship. And that blossomed once China joined the WTO in December of 2001. And both sides, and the Chinese made major concessions to join, monster document of a list of promises that they made to join, drop their tariffs and non-tariff barriers and lots of things. The result of that, of China joining the WTO and us having this relationship, is trade expanded dramatically. In addition to that, investment expanded dramatically. Both companies establishing businesses abroad as well as other types of financial engagement. And I think when the U.S. invited China to join the WTO, as did everyone else, the expectation was that China was a transition economy. It was moving from plan to market, and it needed time to phase in. It's also a developing country. So its commitments included phase-in periods over a number of years. And at the time, when in 2001, if you remember correctly, the U.S. was facing a threat of terrorism because of 9/11, and so the U.S., even though it was concerned about whether or not China would meet all of its commitments, was focused on the Middle East and Afghanistan. Then along came the global financial crisis, and we were focused on addressing the global financial crisis problem. Then, and President Obama during that time also figured that for him, China was a problem trade-wise, but it wasn't the most important problem. First, global financial crisis. Then he wanted the Paris Agreement, and then he wanted to deal with Iran. And for him, China was a future problem. It did some things that that were against U.S. interests, that made the trading relationship unfair, but it was primarily a problem of the future. And so a lot of proposals came across his desk to sanction China, penalize China, and he rejected just about every single one of those, except with regard to Chinese cyber activities, which then resulted in a deal in September of 2015. But otherwise, he basically took a very patient approach and was hoping that China would integrate and adapt. I think what happened is most of a lot of folks in the Obama administration and in the Republican Party and others decided that patience wasn't going to work any longer, and that particularly under Xi Jinping, China's ramped up support of its state sector and industrial policy. It's become much more ambitious, much more money, and that China that patience would never pay off, and therefore you had to do something to arrest this trend. Otherwise, you would be in a much worse place down the road. And so doing nothing, or just being patient and using the mechanisms of the WTO to file cases, and it would just drag things out and never resolve anything. So I think in 2016, regardless of who had been elected president, you would have seen a scratchier relationship, a much more firmer response by the U.S. And so whether it was going to be Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump. And so Donald Trump has basically said, enough's enough. Now, of course, he says it in a way which is quite concerning and distinctive and unique and troubling and worrying, because he's not a very vigorous student of international trade economic theory. He thinks a trade deficit means that you have lost something to another country. So If the U.S. has a $375 billion trade deficit with China, he says the Chinese stole $375 billion. Well, actually, we got $375 billion in goods that we have. So when I go to a store and I give them $5 and I walk out with some water, I don't say they took $5 from me, I show them I got water. He thinks that when you put tariffs on another country, that we're collecting money from that country, even though we're the ones paying the tariffs. So there's lots of that weirdness in his analysis and of his primary trade advisor, Peter Navarro. However, underlying that very odd view about trade is still some reasonable intuition that the relationship isn't fair, and that China is gaming the system and cheating the United States and all of its trading members and countries it does business with, particularly under Xi Jinping. So, and that something had to be done. And so the reason that he went with trade tariffs is to get China's attention, to force the issue so that there was a serious negotiation that addressed the problem here and now and didn't result in just promises to eventually fix their behavior. So that you would think the tariffs do raise prices on everybody, make things more difficult, but the logic is I'm okay with short-term pain for American consumers who go to Walmart and elsewhere if what this means is that eventually the Chinese will change their industrial policy machine and make life better for everybody and fix the global economy. Last point, and I'm sorry to have droned on.
No, this is helpful.
Is that the reason this matters so even folks like myself who think the president's economic logic is way off base, but his intuition makes sense. Why it's worth going through this is one reason, as China's scale. If China were Kenya, Chile, a smaller country, it wouldn't, big deal. You lose some market share, or whatever, but as China's market distortions go, so go the world's market distortions. So when Chinese industrial policy ramps up the production of electric vehicles, and there'll be overcapacity in electric vehicles, that's going to affect global markets. When the Chinese do the same thing with robots, semiconductors, and many other things, those have implications not just for individual companies, but entire supply chains. And so the larger China gets, the bigger the effect for everyone else, and therefore the need to do something. Now, whether tariffs are the ultimate answer is a great debate, which is why we're here tonight.
Great, Scott, that's excellent. Thank you for getting us started there. Roselyn, do you want to pick up where Scott left off? You study, among other things, industrial policy, regulation, state support. Can you talk a little bit about how this plays domestically in China and perhaps a little bit in the U.S. as well?
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you so much, Scott, for laying out kind of the context and also to just describe kind of, overtime, cross-time, longitudinal developments. So I think one perennial question that, scholars of international and comparative political economy often ask is, well, what is our national interest? And oftentimes, national interest don't, or in a liberal economy like ours, it's difficult to pinpoint what is national interest because there's so many different interests, different interest groups, whether they are sector interest groups, industry, business, consumers, industrial users, people who are concerned with foreign economic policy, people who are concerned with foreign policy, and so forth. So in many ways, it's very difficult to define what is the American national interest. Given that, what I want to focus on is the unique challenge and the complex interdependence that China's globalization has created for the United States in defining what is American national interest. Now, obviously, our president, Donald Trump, is the executive, and for now, at least with his tariffs and the trade war, has defined in one respect what is the American national interest. And obviously, we've had a lot of kind of pushbacks from all those different groups I've already mentioned. But how did we even get here in the first place? And so Jonathan had mentioned, the book that I wrote on China's regulatory state, which I called China's globalization strategy. So let me tell you a little bit about this globalization strategy in the context of the different developments that Scott mentioned: the end of the Cold War, the neoliberal era, China joining World Trade Organization, and so forth. So China's globalization has been a liberalization two-step. And what I mean by liberalization two-step is that, in many ways, China has done what everyone expected China to do, which is to liberalize its macro economy. Which is why, for at least a decade after China's accession into the World Trade Organization, the debate around the world, even within the United States, and within the United States, the different groups I mentioned, is China in fact adopting a liberal economic model? But the reason I have identified this globalization strategy as a liberalization two-step is that following or subsequent to that macro liberalization that China has conducted is that two-step, the re-regulation that has in fact indeed occurred. And that re-regulation has occurred with a strategic value logic. And this is really critical. The two-step part of the liberalization is very critical. Scott mentioned that in Washington, D.C., facts are oftentimes distorted. It's important to identify the empirical developments. And I think today, in the United States, among these different societal and consumer and industrial groups, it's actually not in major dispute, the empirical developments that has in fact happened, which is that China has taken the liberalization two-step. It has liberalized, but re-regulated. And right now, what we're trying to figure out as a country, and the United States is not the only country that is grappling with this issue. Countries around the world, whether it's in countries in the European Union, Latin America, Asia, other developing nations, grappling with the re-regulation that China has indeed conducted. And that strategic value logic is that China has liberalized and decentralized much of its economy to the subnational level. But at the most critical issue, in the most critical issue areas, in the most critical sectors that have contribution to the national technology base, that have application for national security concerns, that contribute to the competitiveness of the greater domestic economy, and also China's global economic competitiveness, China has re-regulated in ways that sometimes do adopt the industrial policy that Scott mentioned. That is becoming a problem because countries in the world are finding that, companies and sectors in the world are finding that, in fact, what may appear to be a very liberal market space, in fact, has not been. Once companies enter China, and when I was doing research in China, what I found is everyone and their mother is in China, trying to tap into the market space, try to have a share of the market. But what they have found is that once they've entered the Chinese market, China has re-regulated on investment level, ownership type, what structure the ownership should look like, what kind of business scope a company could, which business areas, which market segments, which technologies can American foreign direct investment or other types of foreign indirect investment could enter. And they're particularly critical issues that foreign businesses have had to confront in these strategic sectors. At the same time, China has in fact liberalized greatly, which is why we're in this space where we have interest groups, we have sectors, we have companies that actually do benefit from China's, that liberal side of the bifurcated economy, the bifurcated market space that is now in fact, what we are experiencing in China. Which is why there's so many debates on whether these tariffs make sense, and why we have companies and sector associations getting together, from the high-tech sectors to the commodities, agreeing that perhaps tariffs are not the best strategy in confronting this unique challenge and the complex interdependence that China's globalization has, created for the world.
Thank you, Roselyn. Since you mentioned tariffs and some of the domestic interest, I think I'm going to turn to Michelle now to talk a little bit about what are some of the intended and unintended consequences of engaging in these kinds of trade actions. As Scott and Roselyn mentioned, there's the initial application of the tariff, but there are a lot of other downstream effects that occur in both directions. And Michelle, being our lone pure play economist on the panel, I would ask to just comment a little bit on that.
Yes, and Roselyn, you made a good point. Of course, we see all the firms wanting a presence in China, and I think these tariffs are going to drive more of that. And we saw that GM yesterday announced the closures, but they didn't announce any closures in China. And they talked about the tariffs costing them, steel and aluminum tariffs costing them about $1 billion. So it makes sense for GM to produce in China and reduce production here. That's the exact opposite of what the president wants, right? He wants production to be domestic. Tesla's doing the same thing. They have now accelerated their plans to build in Shanghai a factory to build maybe 500,000 a year. So I think the tariffs are not the way to go about this. I think there are no winners with tariff trade wars. And I see consumers and U.S. firms as losers in this. And Jonathan, you showed the nice timeline. The very first tariffs were on solar panels and washing machines. And that was sort of a preview of what was to come. And so the washing machines, it was a 20% tariff, and Whirlpool was very happy, and prices went up 22%. But just within 2 months, the steel and aluminum tariffs were levied. And now Whirlpool's not celebrating because most of a washing machine is made from steel. And so they've really struggled with that. And so what we see in the last 4 or 5 months, steel prices have gone up 38%. So with that kind of an increase on an essential input into the production of almost everything in manufacturing and in construction, it's really hurting U.S. firms because we now have to compete against countries that aren't paying 38% more for steel, which makes our firms that have production in the U.S. less competitive. So they are more likely to produce elsewhere where they don't face those types of tariffs. Ultimately, it's the consumer who will bear some of that burden. So firms will absorb some of the cost of tariffs, but most of it will be passed on to consumers in the form of higher prices. And I think what's concerning to me about tariffs is that they're inherently regressive. That is, they affect lower income more than higher income people because lower income people spend disproportionately more of their income on washing machines and other items that include steel and aluminum, most notably cars. And so this hurts. It's very regressive. It's a regressive tax. And it also may reverse some of the benefits of the tax cut, especially for lower income families. So I see U.S. consumers as the big loser. I see U.S. firms relocating, so that means U.S. jobs being lost. There are really no winners in a trade war. And so you have this basic asymmetry that steel and aluminum benefit, but the losses, so the benefits are concentrated, but the losses are spread across all these industries that use steel and aluminum and all consumers who buy these products.
Thank you, Michelle. That's helpful. I'm making a couple notes to myself on follow-ups that I don't want to take time now to do, but later, Roselyn, I want to have you give us an example of the regulatory state rearing its ugly head again, if you will, in China. And later, I want to ask you, Michelle, about whether you see tariffs being inflationary in the short or medium term. But I want to move to Deborah now. Deborah, you study the overall U.S.-China relationship, trade, economic, environmental, and I'm wondering if you can comment on how you see this current environment characterized by a lot of conflict and friction within the context of the broader U.S.-China relationship.
So I mean, the U.S.-China relationship, I think at the moment, I mean, what Scott describes as this sort of feeling of a lot of problems being deferred, I think is a good description of the overall relationship. That we've had greater friction in the South China Sea, we have greater friction on cybersecurity, and we have greater friction on trade. So that there isn't, what's very unfortunate is often in the past, we've had areas where we're doing well together, and then there are areas where we're having trouble, and we can use the areas that we're doing well kind of to keep the relationship going. And right now, we seem to have no areas we're doing well, and even, I was the science counselor in Beijing, and the original treaty between the U.S. and China after normalization in 1979 was the U.S.-China Science and Technology Umbrella Agreement. It had over 30 protocols and 60 or 70 annexes under it, doing everything from health to energy to just every kind of science. And the Trump administration has let it expire. And it let it expire over some disagreements about intellectual property language, but we had negotiated intellectual property arrangement for some energy agreements that I think would have provided a basis for coming up with something that you could have done if there were an interest. But there's a lack of trust that what are we getting out of these agreements, even though there's strong interest on both sides sort of across the board in science. And in many ways, these technical agreements have been part of the ballast of the relationship and part of this shared people-to-people understanding that has been such an important part of the 40-year relationship. And so, and then specifically what I've also been studying is the way congressional attitudes had changed toward China. And so what we had, you know, everybody who studied either my international relations class or trade economics knows that the story of international trade is, while it's beneficial to the country as a whole, there are going to be certain groups that get badly hurt. But when China joined the WTO, there had been an assumption that this overall benefit would be bigger than these specific hurts. And that assumption had sort of been kind of blithely held by both the Bush and the Obama administrations, I think, and without a lot of examination of who was hurt and by how much, until these three economists, O'Toole, Dorn, and Hansen, actually went through and did the math at the local level. And what they found is that throughout the United States in the first decade after China joined the WTO, over 2 million jobs were lost. And they were lost in very specific places. And what my research partners and I and a whole bunch of different research groups have been doing using the O'Toole, Dorn, Hansen data is looking at some of the political implications of that. And what we found was, long before President Trump made it clear that there was a Republican Party against trade with China, because after all, traditionally the Republicans have been the free trade party and the Democrats have been the more protectionist party because they're supposed to be the party of the workers. But many of these districts that were hurt by these tariffs were in very Republican areas. These are the classic kind of working class areas in places like Ohio that we've seen go very Republican in the last 20 years. And if you go back as early as 2005, you start to see changes in voting records in these districts, and we see changes in there are not that many votes on China, so we also see it in their communication with their constituents. We've done text analysis of press releases and that kind of thing. And what you see is that there's been a dramatic change in Republican districts that have been badly hurt by trade. Very little change in Democratic districts because they were already pretty hostile to trade. But if they were Republican, you know, it was Republican votes that helped Bill Clinton get NAFTA through. It was Republican votes that helped with U.S. entry into WTO during the Clinton administration. And those districts are no longer pro-trade districts. And so on the Chinese side, I think that's caught them by surprise. That they had always assumed that Republicans were pro-trade, they were pro-market, that they would have support there. So that's one thing that surprised them. I think they also expected that the business community was going to be there for them. And that's been a dramatic change caused by the things that both Scott and Rosie were talking about, that the business community is much more worried about trade relations now, and whether they're losing intellectual property, whether they're being competed, et cetera, than they were in the 90s, for example, when business was the main lobby for keeping positive trade relations. So the interesting thing that I think right now is the Chinese want to make a deal, and it's not clear what deal the United States is willing to offer. And the U.S. is being hurt, the Chinese are being hurt badly too. Nobody's winning.
Great. So I've really just got two areas I want to cover before we turn things over to the audience here. This is great in terms of sort of laying the groundwork and getting a lot of good information out as far as background and the state of play. Since Deborah started to talk about domestic politics here in the U.S., Scott, I wonder if you could briefly sort of share with us your view on both the current political interests, say, in the Trump administration, where we clearly have some differing views. You mentioned Peter Navarro earlier, but there are obviously others, some of which have now left the administration, and also how you see some of this playing out with the new Congress, the Democratic House in particular.
Sure.
And if I could ask the panelists, you've been doing great. If you could keep your answers a little bit shorter, we can cover more ground and get things over to the audience.
Yeah. Well, the Trump administration runs like a well-oiled machine and consistent, clear voice. So it's hard to describe if there are any differences. I think on trade policy in China, there's really three camps of folks. The first are those who believe the patient strategy was smart and should continue. And they would take any deal that was put on a piece of paper and put in front of the Trump administration. It doesn't matter what's on the piece of paper. They would take it and claim victory and go back to business as usual. So that would include Commerce Secretary Mnuchin, Treasury Secretary Mnuchin, Commerce Secretary Ross. It would have included Gary Cohn, the original National Economic Advisor. They just wanted this problem to go away. The second group, or I'd say, are folks who believe that there is no deal that you can work out with China, and that what we need is a divorce. We need to disengage the two economies, that you can't trust the Chinese, and therefore we need to move supply chains out of China and protect the American national economic foundations, right? And so the best example of that position is Peter Navarro, who I mentioned before. And again, there's no deal that he would ever take because he doesn't think it makes there's not a deal to be had. And so for him, he's not in a negotiation with China. What he is recommending is we are building the tariffs are not a tariff war. For him, the tariffs are permanent things, which he just wants to continue to raise, and then add on investment restrictions, export controls, restrictions on students, all of the different things. And we will then be in his ideal world, right? In between those two are folks who would take a deal that radically restricts Chinese industrial policy, that moves China more toward that liberal, that first step of the model that Rosie mentioned, that is also more consistent with the agreement that China signed when it joined the WTO. Because regardless of whether you're thinking ideologically about whether it's a liberal model or you think there should be regulation, China did sign a piece of paper that promised that it would do certain things, and it's violating that agreement. And so those folks, they would take a deal if China would fundamentally restrict what it's doing in industrial policy. In May, on May 1st, they faxed, or would they have faxed? You never know in governments what ages are. They probably emailed a document, an 8-point document to the Chinese that listed everything they wanted the Chinese to do. It was the encyclopedia of industrial policy, essentially. It was everything possibly the Chinese were doing wrong. The Chinese took that 8 points, they cut it up into 142 points, and looked at it and are like, oh, this is really hard. I don't think we can do this. But in any case, so U.S. Trade Representative Bob Lighthizer is the best representative of the view in the administration that they would take a deal if it would include major restrictions on Chinese industrial policy. Now, the chances, the latter two groups, the Navarro camp, the Lighthizer camp, they have different goals and would accept different outcomes, but they both agree on the same tools, tactics. Unilateral pressure as high as you can get it until the Chinese scream uncle. That's their strategy. So you don't think of them in an agreement with each other, but essentially they are. Last thing I'll say is the president is now facing two arguments from his advisors. Right? The first argument is time is on your side. China's economy is wobbling. Stock market's gone down 40%. Xi Jinping's getting nervous. People in China are upset with the Communist Party, and you just keep pushing them. Eventually, he'll come to the table with a lot more. You know, he says he's a hardliner, whatever, but pressure always works on China. Right? That's the one argument he's facing. Right? Lighthizer and the others are saying just keep going. The other argument he's facing is time is not on your side. You are at the best possible position now you will ever be. 3.7% unemployment in the United States. Stock market is pretty high. Tax cut we're enjoying right now. Next year, the game will be over, right? Stock market's probably going to go down. Growth is going to slow. That sugar high that we're on right now is going to fade away. We are at our most leverage right now. Take a deal. Declare victory. Who cares if you actually win? Just tell everybody. And those voters in those districts that Debbie talked about, they won't know the difference. They will just accept, and then you can go back and continue the kabuki theater and claim victory. Those are the two arguments he's facing as he gets on the plane to go to Argentina.
Helpful, thank you. So we've been talking almost exclusively about China, and before we kind of wrap up the formal part of the panel discussion, I do want to acknowledge, as I did at the beginning, that there's some other trade issues that are out there, one of which has been, I guess we'd say, largely resolved, and that is NAFTA 2.0, known as the US-Mexico-Canada agreement. There's no trade in there. You can still tripping on that. Michelle, I know that you have followed and studied NAFTA and North American trade a little bit. Could you just very briefly give us your assessment of this NAFTA 2.0 or USMCA?
I'll call it NAFTA 2.0.
Thank you.
For ease. So I see some good qualities. The fact that there's a deal and it included Canada was actually in some ways surprising because it was an 11th hour deal that they were able to reach. And it has been modernized, so that includes digital economy and intellectual property rights and things that the cloud computing, all of these things that weren't around 25 years ago for the first NAFTA are now included. In fact, they're even stronger than some of the TPP rules. Mm-hmm. So I see that as a win. A little bit more access to Canada's market for dairy, maintaining or having the sunset clause go 16 years instead of 5, some maintenance of the dispute resolution. I think what I feel is a negative, but there really are two things: the rule of origin with local content and the requirement that a certain percentage of the input into the vehicle has to be produced with a minimum wage of $16. I think this will really disrupt supply chains that have really been integrated over 25 years since NAFTA was signed. The original rule of origin was that 62.5% of the value of the content had to be produced in a North American country, Canada, US, or Mexico. That is now 75%. So these supply chains that have been around for a quarter of a century are now disrupted. And in addition to that, there's the requirement that about 40% of the value has to be made with labor making $16 an hour. That pretty much means the US or Canada, and diminishes Mexico's role there. And I don't see how you can impose a minimum wage on another country. Everyone in Mexico would want to work in the auto industry and nowhere else at $16 an hour. So I see that ultimately raising the cost of production of automobiles within North America, and something that I didn't think was necessary. That would probably be the worst part of it, but the fact that there was a deal, the auto industry is happy because of the uncertainty when the deal was likely not on track, or the potential of withdrawing from NAFTA. Those were scenarios that were extremely difficult.
We didn't talk about this ahead of time, but with a little background, I agree with you 100%. I do. Perfect. I have a bunch of other questions for the panelists here, but I gotta believe that since we've been going on for a little bit here, you also have some questions. So let me take a moment here to open it up and see if there's some things that we've touched on that you want to follow up on, or maybe some other issues that we haven't gotten around to that are relevant to this overall context of trade wars and trade disputes. Ruth?
I got a billion questions, but
Start with one, and we're going to try to keep the start with one. We're going to try to keep the questions
Okay.
brief and the responses
it's very
brief.
brief. It
Yep.
just seems to me that to start imposing tariffs when you've had 25 years of a global supply chain, which counted on no tariffs, it just seems like it's inherently going to be inflationary and difficult. And I wondered if you could tell me whether China is a developmental state like the other states in East Asia, and different because of course it started as communist and then went that way. But still, it just seems like you're trying to tell another state how they should organize themselves and how they should kind of do all of their policy. And I don't see how that works, and I definitely don't see how it's going to work today. I just wonder if we're still that strong as we think we are.
So maybe we could come back to my question earlier about what when you say re-regulate, what are some examples of that? And are they things that can be reversed through this pressuring of China using tariffs and potentially other kinds of trade actions?
Yeah, great. Thanks for the questions. Actually, I started when I was writing my book. I started with that question: is China the developmental state? And so I will answer that. In my book, and also just in my research, I say no. And the reason I say no, China is not your typical East Asian developmental state, because first of all, it was a different global era. It was during the Cold War. It was also during an era where the East Asian developmental states, Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, these countries were under Allied protection and had ready markets. And so they were able to, protect domestic industry in a way and restrict foreign direct investment in a way that China wasn't able to under the neoliberal era. So that's why there is that liberalization, first step, to begin with, because China had to open up because of its commitment to the WTO, to open up on the macro level. But there is still the two-step, and perhaps this is where the similarities with the developmental state often conjures up for people, which is, well, China did open up, yet the re-regulation has happened. And so China has not restricted foreign direct investment in the same way that Taiwan, Japan, South Korea has. Yet, once foreign direct investment comes in or goes into China, there are many other methods and mechanisms, non-tariff mechanisms, that the Chinese government has in fact instituted. So I'll just give one quick example.
Please.
So Apple computers making smartphones, and with the help of contract manufacturer Foxconn, which is a Taiwanese multinational. And Apple was actually one of the companies that between July and September, when Trump released that list of over 5,000 tariff lines, between those 2 months, actually was able to, along with a few other companies, lobby for 200 or so tariff lines to be taken off the original list. And one of the reasons why Apple Computer has done so is because Apple, does contract manufacturing in China. It, takes advantage of, China's, lower costs. So Apple aspires to be both market pursuing because it wants to tap into a Chinese market, but also efficiency pursuing because it's getting lower costs in China. But it's complex because on one hand, Apple, the smartphones rely on inputs that then get exported to the manufactured in China, gets exported into the United States, and Apple has to deal with the tariffs on those inputs into the smartphone. Then Apple's gonna, get hurt, and also consumers of Apple smartphones will get hurt. So Apple is not really happy about these tariffs. At the same time, Apple is market pursuing. It wants to be in China, but what does Apple face? Restrictions on the telecommunication market due to that re-regulation that has occurred. Meaning, Apple cannot sell its Apple phones in Apple stores in China without joint ventures with China Mobile, one of the largest state-owned telcos. And even though China made all these promises to allow in up to 49% ownership in telecom basic services, China has actually, in fact, has not done that despite that WTO commitment. It's allowed up to less than 9%. And under international rules of what foreign direct investment is, China does not allow FDI in basic services and telecoms because it only allows up to 9%. I think the last time I checked, it was Spain's Telefonica that has 9% in one of the telcos. And so that's an example of the re-regulation. But Apple, in many ways, is part of that the complex interdependence.
Great, thank you. Let's get some more short questions and short answers in here. Maybe from a student or two. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is John Vernon. I'm a third year at the law school. You touched a little bit on intellectual property. Curious as to how that has affected what's been going on, and you talked about tariffs. Everyone's kind of losing, it sounds like. What then is a solution then for these businesses that where their trade secrets are being stolen by the Chinese?
Great. Scott, why don't I have you start with that?
Yeah, that's a huge problem. China's got immense leverage to have companies hand over IP, either willingly, because you want access to the market, or through regulation and demanding it. The Chinese like to say tech transfer, there's no compulsion, it's all voluntary. In fact, there are specific regulations and then policy practices. Basically, they take companies, line them up against the wall and say, which one of you are going to hand over the technology? You're the ones that get the deal. Now, that actually that's actually allowed by international rules, but it's still coercive. Then you've got cyber theft and those kinds of problems. Obviously, tariffs aren't going to address those things, but again, my view is the tariffs, and I'm not trying to sound like I want to be the trade. Didn't want to be the trade hawk advocate of the panel.
Oh no, we need one, please.
But I do think we now have China's attention, and then can we come up with new agreements that deal with intellectual property problems, cyber, and all of the other protecting commercial secrets. That's going to require many other things that we deal with, and also some things that it may not be bilateral solutions. Maybe some of these solutions are going to come through TPP or the WTO or other places, and so let's not lose the great opportunity that a trade war provides to potentially find some solutions, even though in the short term it does raise all the costs and all the other.
Let me ask a quick follow-up, and it's the question that Debbie left us with, and just maybe a short answer, Scott. Is it the case, though, that this administration is not such a fan of multilateral solutions? In fact, in bilateral solutions, it seems to preference kind of very specific, almost managed trade agreements as opposed to kind of broad liberalizing initiatives. So I could see a deal that compels China to do something very specific with regard to this foreign ownership requirement, as opposed to agree to some broad principles that are some extension of the the WTO TRIPS agreement, for example.
Yeah, it's very unusual. I think this goes back partly just to Trump's intuition that the U.S., because it's a big power, has more advantage in a bilateral one-on-one negotiation than when you have a bunch of folks at the table. Especially if in that multilateral setting you get free riders who don't have to give as much or who can cheat, and then you have a difficult time getting compliance. So I kind of understand that in theory, but the practice is that in a multilateral setting you are able to address a much wider scope of issues because you have a whole bunch of smaller trade-offs that occur at the same time, and that you can deal with your milk issue, your cheese issue, your wood issue by doing it multilaterally. So I still think at some point they will need to go back. All of these things can't be fixed simply by making a bilateral deal with the U.S. or just unilaterally doing things. So I think it's USMCA. It doesn't have to be TPP or CPTPP. It can be the Trump partnership or something like that, and they will come back. And I will say, I've talked to the other 11, and if you ask them, would you accept the U.S. if they came back? The answer consistently is in a heartbeat.
Yeah.
They would all take them back,
Yep.
and they all would give more. So Trump could also, as Michelle was identifying with USMCA, come up with that list of goodies that proves it's better than what Obama or the others got.
Great.
And to your point, Scott, I think the Trump administration is now more receptive to working with Japan and the EU against China rather than what we saw at the G7 this summer, where there was infighting versus being unified to leverage China a little bit more.
Yeah.
Yeah, because one of the things is when we get to all these issues, all of the developed countries have the same issues with China that the U.S. does. European companies are just as frustrated as U.S. companies with forced tech transfer, intellectual property protection, et cetera. I mean, I think the U.S. kind of missed the boat for a lot of reasons for a lot of years. I mean, one of the things was that we continued to sort of imagine that intellectual property theft involved some guy with a briefcase for years after it was all moving in cyberspace. And it's like, it wasn't until 2014 when we had the first US case against Chinese cyber theft. And, we had that conversation when I was at the embassy and I left in 2007. It was a bit of a mystery.
Mm.
And the other thing on the forced tech transfer is we often mix up legitimate with non-legitimate stories. So I work mostly on energy, where the Chinese have been super smart at forcing really good tech transfer deals when there are no other customers for big Western companies in the world. When there's a slump in the energy market, and the only place back in the 80s it was coal-fired power plant technology, in the early 2000s it was nuclear technology. They were the sole buyer. Of course they could get what they wanted, and there was nothing illegitimate about that at all. And so having a kind of slow, patient, and to some extent planned economy in this way has given them advantages. One of the other points we always make in the energy sector is the U.S. has lost a lot of advantages by having inconsistent energy policy, right? If we had had consistent support for solar and wind over the last 20 years, I mean, we were the world leaders 20 years ago. We lost that because of our policy failures. And so when we talk about things that haven't happened, like the ever-delayed infrastructure week, a lot of that is about U.S. policy inconsistency that has really disadvantaged us relative to China.
Great, let's try to get a couple more questions in here. Paul.
So the focus is all on China, but actually I would argue that there's an overemphasis on China. So sure, it is a large economy, but it happens to also be a large population. One would expect a country with such a large population would have such a large economy. As a matter of fact, we know that it's not as large as by per capita as it would be if it had the same standard of living as the United States or other countries. But in the meantime, we're completely overlooking the fact that Germany, with 80 million people, is running a $250 billion surplus. The largest 10% of its economy is in a current account surplus. Italy is about 100 billion or so. And then you have Japan running over 100 billion. And so these are really large current account surpluses that they're running. While China is actually close to, I think this year, close to a deficit. And so, as a matter of fact, it seems like they're actually, once you take in goods and services and other transfers, it turns out that they don't seem to be such a big deal. So it seems like it's sort of trumped up charges, so to speak. In the meantime, we're missing a lot of other imbalances that might exist.
I think the president is concerned about the European Union. So he even reiterated yesterday about the 25% tariff on autos if there is not some concessions. He views the trade deficit with the EU as the singular problem. And he feels that if you put tariffs, you can reduce the trade deficit. Really, tariffs reduce the volume of trade, but there's other foundations that cause us to have trade deficits. We like German cars in the US. We love Mercedes and BMW and Audi. We're a booming economy. We have low unemployment. The tax cuts are fueling some of this spending. Our trade deficits are a function, our dollar strong. They're a function of so many other things, not just Europe is treating us badly. So I do think the administration is concerned about the EU. I feel he's been pretty focused. At one point he called the European Union a foe to the US, right, over the summer. So I think he is concerned, but I also would argue that we shouldn't just be focused on the deficits, because the factors that contribute to deficits and surpluses are so much bigger than someone's trading unfairly with us.
And we should have mentioned at the beginning that there was also negotiations on a US-EU trade agreement. They were not as far along as the TPP, and the Obama administration itself kind of walked away because it had too many things going on. But there was some discussion of restarting those negotiations. The EU and Canada did reach a trade agreement that they concluded once part of Belgium signed on. But I do think it's one of the regions or areas that it continues to have a primary focus, although you're correct that I think China has been the recipient of much of the histrionics, if you will, around trade. We've got about 10 more minutes by my clock. I'd like to get one or two more questions in from you, and then I have kind of a concluding question. So what haven't we covered? What haven't we touched on, perhaps, that you in the audience are interested in learning more about? Students. Yes?
Hi, so my name's Colin. So I don't know if any of you guys saw this, but Bloomberg came out with an article about a week ago, I think, with some research for some European researchers that essentially said that as of right now, China is kind of footing most of these costs of the trade war. And I guess what I want to ask you is, what do you guys think that there could be, or what would you be looking for in a new deal that would kind of make you say, like, okay, I guess this could have been worth it, or is there anything?
That's a great question. That was going to be one of my concluding questions, but I'm glad that you asked it. So why don't we ask each of the panelists very, very briefly to just offer their view of kind of what would be a reasonable deal and what's the prospects or likelihood of it happening, as brief as you can. Scott, I'll start with you and we'll just go right across here.
Sure. I've been having an argument with another colleague who works in D.C., and he doesn't like to call this a trade war. He says this trade war is about the tools we're using to whack each other with. This is really a high-tech war. Really, it's about competition for the commanding heights of economies, your own national foundations, and then competing globally. And I think there's something to that. Although what the U.S. is certainly concerned about China and national security. And so in some ways they don't want the Chinese to get the best technology because of how it could be used in a military sense. But I think most folks say what we want is we're happy to compete with the Chinese if we are competing on roughly even ground. So for me, for me the ultimate goal isn't whether I get China or not. I'm a big believer in the liberal international order. Right, that's where I start, and I want the liberal international order to be defended at home and globally. And I want it, right now, I don't think the U.S. is living up to the liberal international order. I want to try to figure out how to pull them back in.
By the way, students, when just to be clear, when Scott says liberal, he doesn't mean big L liberal like liberal ideology. He means liberal like open, just to make sure we're all on the same page here.
So that wasn't a campaign, implicit campaign slogan for Bernie Sanders or something, as nice as he is. But for me, so I guess number one is China's got to commit to constrain how much subsidies it provides to its industries, and it has to be much more transparent in how it provides them. And if it's going to provide them, then everyone should be able to get them. I should be able to get them. Rosie should be able to get them. You should be able to get them. You don't have to be just a Chinese company to get them. I think you should limit them, but make them, don't be discriminatory about them. That's number one. And then China's got to open up its markets in areas that haven't been opened up. Essentially, Rosie mentioned some of them, but basically high value-added services. So she mentioned telecommunication services, but that would also mean logistics, healthcare, education. So if Villanova wants to open a campus in China all by itself and compete for Chinese students to go to school in China or whatever they can. So those are things that I think, there's a whole list of those. Basically all of that would require the Chinese to say, you know what, that re-regulation, that two-step, we're going to go to the third step and do something a little bit different. To me, that would make it worth it to sign a deal and say, we're not going to have uncertainty and anxiety about what's going to come down the road. We can deal with that in sort of more normal, regular diplomatic cause. But that's what I would
So
do.
I'm going to focus this question a little bit, given that Scott covered a good amount of the ground. Rosie, is that a realistic prospect for China to commit to what Scott has outlined here? Is there any hope or chance that China would commit to those kinds of pretty radical, substantive, deeply felt commitments that would really change the nature of Chinese industrial policy?
So I think the idea of equal playing field is quite important, and I think that the United States should recognize the areas where in China where there is already that equal playing field. And I think by recognizing that first and then targeting on particular issue areas, many of which we've already pointed out, I think that strategy or that way of negotiating would be more welcoming to the Chinese. So it's not all that, you're imposing industrial policy on everything. No, in fact, there has been aspects or areas and dimensions that have been very liberal, but these are particular key areas that need focus, and we need to have equal playing field in.
Great. I'm going to skip you, Michelle, and come back and go to Debbie, and I wonder if you could, in commenting about a deal, comment also on how this plays to the broader U.S.-China relationship as you did earlier in the conversation.
So I'm somewhat skeptical about how deep structural change we can expect from China right now. This doesn't appear a moment when that's what the Chinese government is interested in. So I don't quite picture the sort of what sounds like an all-encompassing deal that Scott was mentioning coming through. And ultimately, I think a deal between the U.S. and China is also going to need to have some understandings about security. That the level of aggression the Chinese have in the South China Sea, the U.S. finds quite intolerable. Usually, Scott's portrayal of people on the trade side in Washington generally rolling over, I think, is a little unkind to the career trade negotiators. But I do think that oftentimes in Washington, security concerns are put higher than trade concerns. But I don't think security concerns are gone. And so I do think there are still trade-offs to be made in terms of reducing the level of tension in, especially maritime. And I would not claim to be a maritime expert, but I do think that's an area that there may be room there as well. And I just, given the nature of domestic Chinese politics right now, I'm skeptical that you're going to see huge changes in the way industry is managed, which I think does leave room for what Rosie's talking about of sort of addressing specific issues and coming to specific accommodations that is still within this quasi-planned or certainly prioritized economy.
I'm actually going to go back to Scott for a quick question. Could you see at the G20 or shortly after kind of a deal to make a deal, kicking the can down the road, something that says, well, we can't figure this all out, but we're going to sort of put a pause in everything and take stock or even step back and figure it out down the road, claim a mini victory, if you will?
I think that depends on whether it's going to be a red pill day or blue pill day.
Okay.
And it's genuinely very difficult to say. People who work in the administration have a hard time figuring out how the White House is going to act on anything specifically. And it could depend on what Mr. Mueller is doing that day, or what the stock market is doing. So how the flight to Buenos Aires goes, or whether they sign USMCA before or after he meets Xi, and what kind of mood he's in, and then what's Xi doing, Xi Jinping doing? Is he going to try and sweet talk Donald Trump? So I think, but regardless, it would be superficial.
Mhm.
It would
Yeah.
not address any of the
Yeah.
fundamental things that we talked about today.
Yeah. Michelle, I'm going to give you the last word. If you could maybe, as you did earlier, kind of put what's happening with the U.S.-China trade issues in kind of this broader context of the overall administration's trade policy and some of these other challenges that we've touched on, like in the EU with TPP, et cetera.
So, if I can first, Scott,
Sure.
I agree that our window is narrow to address these because the U.S. economy is strong, but there might be some inflationary pressure
Yes.
building. We're at full employment or slightly above. Wages increased to 3.1%. That may continue. The Fed is going to be raising interest rates, which could dampen some growth. And I feel that if there's any inflationary shock from the tariffs and the Fed raises interest rates, then we could be looking at a slowdown in the U.S. economy. And I think we're already seeing a global slowdown,
Yes.
in part because of the implications of the tariffs throughout Asia. And so, not to be doom and gloom, although economists are the dismal science, I do see potential inflationary pressure. I do see a slowdown in growth. And I think that having a trade war on multiple fronts with China, with the EU, one thing that you asked about, we have tariffs now with our closest allies, our NAFTA partners with the EU. That's somewhat unprecedented. Last time we had steel tariffs during the Bush years, they were all excluded. EU was exempt, China, Mexico. So if we're going to be fighting a trade war on multiple fronts, I feel that the global economy will be weaker and the U.S. as a result, because we can't export if the global economy is weaker. So I do see some negative implications for the U.S. economy.
So I'm going to leave it there, but I have a few concluding comments I'd like to share with you. The first, I'd like to thank all the panelists for their thoughtful insight, their commentary, and their intellectual firepower. So thank you so much. As I had said at the beginning, I really hope to accomplish a lot in a short period of time, and I feel as if we did. Secondly, to you students, you can see some incredible faculty here. If you happen to go to Temple for graduate school, we can also endorse Rosie here, but in particular, take Debbie's courses, take Michelle's courses. They have so much to offer you, and these are important issues. I know sometimes we think they're kind of very macro, they're out there in the ether, they don't affect us. They do affect us, and they will continue to affect us. Finally, as a little preview, given the importance of these issues, for the annual VSB Research Insights Symposium, which will be in May, we're, in a sense, sticking with this theme, making it a little bit broader. We're going to be talking about the future of globalization. And Debbie, I already have you planned as a presenter in this conference, so I hope that you're going to be available. But we have Robert Lawrence coming from Harvard as the keynote presenter. We have some other faculty from the area, from Penn, Temple, and elsewhere. So we hope that you can join us to pick up this conversation in May. We hope maybe there's a little bit more of a positive, optimistic tone. But once again, please join me in thanking the panelists for spending their time with us here today. And we'll all stay around here for a few minutes if you have some